So, hello and welcome. My name is Steve Pugh, and I do something called a growth strategy podcast. We broadcast all over the world, actually, and with my startup, it's called a Roadmap MBA. We've got users in 53 countries now. And what we try and do, almost as part of, we do live streams and that kind of thing, but it's to share the stories of really interesting people that can help you in your business or career. But also, we like to debate loads of really interesting stuff that's going on in the media and the news now. And me and Louise kind of connected recently. It was to do with a particular post to do with a panel which had 7 white middle-aged men who looked like me. But the point was, it was all to do with diversity and why that's really important and that kind of thing. And again, I love to debate these things because it doesn't mean that I'm right or I'm wrong. And I saw another one yesterday, which was a whole panel of other men from a Teesside event. And it's that kind of thing of, I think it's really important to kind of talk about these things. And International Women's Day was only, I don't know, a month and a half ago. And it's like, it's one of those things that annoys me. But I also like to get on guests that have a really interesting story to tell, ideally to do with entrepreneurship, but also things like social mobility and some other stuff as well. So if a guest can tick more of these boxes, even better. And if you join us for the next kind of half an hour or so, hopefully it's an interesting conversation. And if you get in touch in the comments, it should pop up on my screens, so I should be able to bring it in, or you can catch up on YouTube as well. So Louise, there we go. People can now see you and hear you.
Hi there.
How's your Thursday been so far?
It's been very good, thank you. Been looking forward to this.
Really? It's funny. I was going to say most people dread it. It's the some people hate the idea that it's live, but I actually appreciate it and think it's better because it's a genuine conversation. As someone that edits a lot of video, there's nothing worse than when you're like, oh, that bit wasn't perfect. We take that out. We tweak it as well. I think there's an honesty about the fact that it's live that I think in the world of AI in 2023 and a lot of the new profiles, I think there's going to be a big element on trust of what we've seen here on the internet in some ways that actually I kind of like it. Plus, actually, from a purely editorial point of view, once you know that content is already out in the world, you worry about it less as well. I'm one of these people that I will and over tiny little tweaks on things that people will never notice. But actually...
Well, sorry, Steve, I was just going to say, when I get my words wrong, when I fall over something, when I forget something I have to say and go back, then we'll know that it's real.
No, it's cool. So would you be happy to give a quick kind of intro to yourself, your background, where you're from, what you do now?
Sure. So I was born in Newcastle in the UK, given your international audience. I've made loads of mistakes along the way, but I've also had loads of help. And I got some qualifications that for me were quite amazing qualifications to have achieved. I got a law degree, a legal practice certificate, a Master of Science and a certificate in company direction. So that led me to a 25-year career in blue chip tech, BT, SAP, Sopra Steria, and I provided the commercial wrap for tech solutions, reaching the C-suite, and I had absolutely incredible experiences along the way, and I'm now at the stage where I've got a couple of my own businesses. I live in the south of England with Paul, my second husband. I'm 54, and I really do care about inclusion and belonging, probably shaped by the experiences that I've had.
Can I be brutally honest? Can you stop looking at the piece of paper? It's one of those things. But when we mentioned at the start about how people want this authentic, the answers don't have to be perfect, but it's that balance of when I can see.
Sure. I don't want to forget the messages, but yeah, go on.
No, it's cool. But it's that balance of where I love this. I remember I once went to. We're going to talk about TEDx talks and that kind of thing as well. I once went to. It wasn't a TEDx talk, but it was an energy event, and there was a UK politician came up to an event at the Sage in Gateshead, and he technically delivered the speech well, but he kept doing this. And so ironically, it's when people just like freestyle it and just it's the personality and that kind of thing that's when the magic shines. So I do it as an encouraging, friendly friend to kind of get the most out of your magic and stuff. So is it true that you grew up in Newcastle?
Yes, in Benwell, which is in the West End of Newcastle. And at the time, in the 70s, it was picked as a community development project because it was recognised that there was pockets of poverty in the UK, Benwell being one of them. And the idea was to try and change that. I think looking back, nothing really, even today, nothing much has changed. So it wasn't that successful. And as I was growing up, I knew nothing about that, but that is the sort of environment that I was growing up in. It was very, very working class.
Mm-hmm.
I've reflected today actually that it wasn't at all diverse ethnically, that there were, in a class of maybe 30 kids, there would be maybe one or two from an Asian background, very few black and other ethnic minorities. So it wasn't diverse. It was quite insular, friendly, but insular. We didn't look outside a huge amount.
But I think what I find funny is that, so I grew up in Liverpool, and it was almost identical. So for instance, I come from a town called Mughal, and it's got about 25,000 people. It's just north of the city. And there's two main high schools. There's one called Maricourt High School and there's one called Daythai. There was only one black family in the whole town. And it was almost what I really found interesting was that when I went to university, I was with people from all around the world. And it sounds silly, but I'd never been exposed to different cultures. And it wasn't a negative thing. It wasn't something that happened but on purpose. So it was just different people from different life circumstances experience different things. And one of the things why I think this will be a really interesting conversation is that for two people that have both gone on to do quite well, it's when, like, I definitely grew up working class. My family still fall into that boundary, but no mistake, I'm definitely middle class now, but I still have that value system. I get the challenges that people face. But I'm with you, is that I went to a school careers day on Friday 2 weeks ago, and it was in Gosforth. But it was a brilliant, diverse group of people. I kind of wished I grew up in that. And it's
Much better now.
But it's funny how the world changes, but then likewise, it's not, you didn't do anything wrong, I didn't do anything wrong. That was just the way those communities were built historically. But I do think the world's a better place, a more diverse place, because actually one of the conversations that I've had with my wife is that people that we know, they're not racist in a way that they would treat anyone differently, but because they don't necessarily know a huge amount of diverse people, they don't know what cultures are like and how they interact, and that lack of knowledge on different cultures, different attitudes, different things, almost there is a barrier there. But I know that it's not an intentional one, but it does happen, and especially in north of England, poorer working class backgrounds from the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, so I would my turn to challenge you now, because I would say sometimes it is still intentional and deliberate.
Okay.
And again, I've thought a lot for this conversation, and thinking back then, we had two schools. I went to Rutherford School, it was a comp, and we had two school buildings, and between the two there was a corridor. It was a corrugated iron corridor, and it was a terrifying place to have to walk between lessons. And I was thinking about how it looked. I haven't really thought about this for years and years, but there was two things that were really, really prevalent that kids had drawn on there. One was pictures of penises, and loads of them, with black marker pen. And the other thing was the NF symbol for the National Front. That was there. It was prevalent, and there was, I think, born out of fear and misunderstanding largely, but regrettably, there is still racism, and I think, again, important to acknowledge it.
I think
wherever it comes from.
No, I think it was going to be one of my later questions, as you know, but almost based on that kind of thing, what are your feelings around social mobility, what it can do to outlooks and life opportunities and stuff, but actually why it's important?
So social mobility, I think, is really important, so that we get the best brains. So the best brains to drive the country forward, to drive the world forward. And the best brains is not necessarily the most well-educated brains, the most, the richest people. It can be anybody who's got, fortunate to have the processing power. So I think we miss out as a society if we don't have that, and we don't encourage their participation. So that's why I'm passionate about it. The impact of it can be that you're not given sight of what you could be. You're dismissed, if you like, and expectations are not high. My expectations when I was at school was that I would be seen and not heard, that I wouldn't bring trouble to the door. the fear of teenage pregnancy was real. I know people who were pregnant as teenagers who are my friends. They've gone on to do great things, but that at the time was a concern. So you're just limited in the outlook that you have because that's all you saw. And so I think it's such a shame, and the world will be better if we can open that up. And
No, I agree.
that's why.
I think one of the things that so when I was growing up, most people kind of went on to do kind of what their family did or someone that they knew did. And actually, this was obviously before the internet, but it was that you didn't necessarily know. You had television, but you didn't really know what else was out there. And you didn't necessarily know that it was a viable option to you as well. Hopefully now with the internet, part of the reason why I love to do this is that, you know, people could be in the middle of India and they could technically watch this conversation and say, well, actually, that's really interesting. And I love that democracy of knowledge and the ability now that would, you know, there are good people trying to break down barriers to help access to stuff. But it's just the feeling of options that are or aren't available to you, I think is really important. And I was saying this to someone the other day, is that I did as the careers day, as I mentioned. And, you know, I was there as like a startup and you had lots of different organizations. No word of a lie. When I was at when I was at school, we had a careers day come in, but one of them was a talk from a prison officer. And they went on to tell you about all the horrible things that happen. He was from Walton Prison. If you go to prison, that you have 3 fights when you first get into your cell. One is who gets top bunk, bottom bunk. The other one is which end you can put your head so you don't get shivved. And I can't remember what the third one was. But the point was, that was a genuine thing that they brought people in. And it wasn't, oh, you can become an architect. You can become a pilot. It was, don't go to prison. And it was just, you know, I have friends who are teachers. And I sometimes get the impression that the ways that some, not all, but some schools are incentivized is to do with how you just get the bulk of students through a system to tick a box to get their funding. As opposed to, there was a guy called Sir Ken Robinson who was really famous in education, and he actually grew up 4 miles from me in a part of Liverpool next to the Everton Stadium. And he went on to do incredible things in education, but his big life mission was to do with customizable education for different personalities, backgrounds. So that if someone was very creative and they wanted to be a dancer or whichever as a young person, that they shouldn't necessarily be forced to do science, maths, stuff that just they have no interest in, because that's not who they are. As where actually a lot of people are still forced to do set curriculums, especially sub-16, that I see the pros and cons for it. But the point is, it's that, you know, I think we're now at a point where there's a pivot where people actually have more opportunity to discover what's really important to them, and hopefully like the systems to kind of let it thrive.
So there's 2 things that I would, you know, 2 different views there on that. One is, one of the things I was going to bring up is my career's advice was, do you want to be a hairdresser or do you want to be a secretary? That was it. I had no other real choices mentioned to me. And the other thing is, what if you or your environment selects you out of something? So right up until I was probably 30, I thought I couldn't do science. No way I could do anything scientific. I've now got a Master's of Science. So I think, yes, we need to make it much broader. Yes, we should tailor it. But how do we make sure that people aren't discounted or discouraged from doing something that they could be really great at? I was going to talk, if you don't mind, while I just chat on. One of the things I remembered is when I was about 12, we were chatting at school, my friends, and somebody said, what do you want to do when you leave school? And I said, probably for the first time out loud, I really quite fancy being a journalist. And her response to that was, and she had an older sister, and she said to me, but you need O-levels for that. I didn't know what O-levels were. O-levels, my parents had no real knowledge of the education system, and they didn't tell me you need to do this and you need to do none of that. Just don't be trouble. So when she said you need O-levels, I had no, and then now GCSEs, I had no idea what they were, but it was obvious from her tone that I wasn't going to have them.
Yeah.
I never raised it again, never mentioned being a journalist ever again. So when I got to, do you want to be a hairdresser or do you want to be a secretary? I can't even do my own hair. So I have to be a secretary. And that's what led me to the Freeman Hospital.
No, cool. I just want to say hi to Apicorn in Bangkok as well. She often joins in, but I'd love to know actually if you can put in the comments, Do you get this in Thailand? How do you know? Is it the same in the UK as it is there? Because that's the big thing, that both of us, I guess, only necessarily have English points of view of how we were raised. But actually, and that's part of the reason I love to do this, is actually people around the world have completely different systems, and it might be, especially as a woman in Bangkok, it might be completely different for the men. So no, thank you for getting in touch. I have different screens where the comments kind of come up and stuff. So would you be happy to almost cover or talk us through some of your career journey? Because what I'm always fascinated to do, for the exact reason you've just mentioned, is to talk about how you got from where you were to what kind of where you are now, to show those career paths and talk through some of the trials, tribulations, things that went well, things that went wrong, in a way that you never know someone could watch this from anywhere and actually kind of find inspiration from it.
Absolutely. So the Freeman Hospital was one of the most awesome things that ever happened to me. It was, at the time, it was doing children's heart transplants, one of the first in the world to do it. It was like all of us who were working there would come down. Been a heart transplant overnight, a child, we were all holding our breath and hoping that child was going to be all right. But also, one of the things that you said is that there were people from, you met at university, people from all over the world. And at the Freeman, that's where I met people from all over the world. I got a real strong image of doing some Greek dancing just as we approached in the office, as we approached the Christmas holidays, because one of the doctors was Greek and he was a bit homesick at the time. And just 5 minutes of, never done Greek dancing before, but just seeing those different people. So I was inspired on all sorts of different levels, but I had a consultant that I worked for. So I was in admin, and he was a newly created consultant cardiologist, and he'd just come back from the States, and he came back to take up this post, and he had an Apple Mac tucked under his arm, and he brought it in, and he's like, "We want you to use this computer." And we were like, "It's a computer, but it's called an app." Anyway, we didn't get that at all, but we had to use this computer. And he gave me opportunities to do work that was totally unexpected. Phil Adams, Dr. Phil Adams then, Professor Phil Adams now, he gave me opportunities that nobody probably should have given me, and I grabbed them and took them. And so I did some original work, and he named me in the medical journals of research papers that we published. I was a teenager from Benwell, no qualifications, and he recognised the work I'd done. I just think so few people, even today, would have named me.
I think I've had something similar. Actually, one of my previous guests was a lady called Lena, but it's how people that don't have to sometimes choose to go out of their way and do the right thing. But what my point is, it's how something small 20 years ago can really transform your entire life. One of the big things that really got me was that when I went to university, so I did a foundation year because I did the wrong A-levels, took the wrong advice, but I wanted to do engineering. So I did a foundation year. It was very maths intensive, but I was terrible at it because then I've been taught to do it. It was university level. It was difficult stuff. And I would have failed just because it was really hard. And for me, there was a lady called Dr. Nicole Nossum. And basically on lunch times, in her own time, she did these extra maths tutor stuff to get you enough that you could pass and go through. But she didn't have to. She didn't get paid to do it. But it's funny that I'll probably always remember that name.
And I will always remember and check that name, absolutely, always.
And then it just allows you, as you kind of get to a position, that's part of the reason why I try and use this platform however I can for different people, is because I can, and someone did it for me. And it's the ability that, the truth is, and I've seen it firsthand, not everyone does. And I've seen very selfish people act in their own selfish interest. But I know how hard it is, especially for working class people, to fight their way up. That it's almost, I guess it is what it is, but it's great when you hear kind of good people. So what happened next?
So seeing this published article, and there was like 5 or 6 of us on the teams of doing the research, and I was the only one that didn't have qualifications after my name. And I felt really ashamed and embarrassed rather than proud of the achievement. And so I started going to night classes. There was me and a porter, and we used to get the bus after work and go and do night classes at the college in Newcastle College. And that brings me to one of the next inspirations in my life. who was a lecturer in law. I chose to do an A-level in law because I looked at the prospectus and I was like, you could do an A-level in law? I didn't think, and then I can be a solicitor, or I didn't think anything other than law. I've been watching the bill and it's like, this is fantastic. So I did law and I pitched up at the first class, and the lecturer, she's called Joan, and I don't think I ever knew, and I certainly can't remember her surname, but I really wish I knew it. So Joan was a Geordie like me, broad Geordie, sounded like she smoked 60 a day, sounded like she could beat anybody in a fight. And she had studied law because of social housing and justice. So she taught herself law, and now she's a lecturer. And that's probably the first time that I saw an ordinary person in that kind of a role. So I loved her class and did well in it because of that. And she was really encouraging. She was funny. She was so down to earth. And she really probably brought me out of myself. So then I had I had an A-level in law. I had married the guy that I was my boyfriend in school, kind of as I expected, but he had family aspirations. He'd had an uncle who'd been to university, so he went to Liverpool University, and I used to go. So yeah, I remember.
What year is this? I'm trying to picture the scene.
Yeah, so this is 1987.
Okay, yeah.
1987, he'd gone to university. I was visiting, going down to visit him in Liverpool, but also I was doing my night classes and working. And when he came back, tell me if I'm going too slow on this. When he came back, we got married because I couldn't leave home and live with somebody till I was married.
Again, look at how the world's changed.
Expectation, yeah, absolutely. My parents really aspired for me to have a mortgage, so bought our own house. 22 we were by this time. But then something was really stirring in me, and after a year of living together, married back in the Northeast, I applied to Northumbria University. Well, I applied to all of the universities in the Northeast. Northumbria was the only one that said, yes, come and do a degree in law. I still can't believe that happened. And so they let me in.
Of interest. Do you know why the others said no? Just out of interest?
They just didn't give me, I didn't get an interview.
But isn't that funny that so there's 6 or 7 universities in the Northeast, but imagine you only applied to 5 and you got 5 rejections, and it was the 6th one that landed. That was like Northumbria. But it's that balance of it's a thing that I've had, and on the podcast people have told me I'm wrong, but I always thought that it was a working class thing to have that resilience, because you've got to fight, because otherwise nobody's going to help you out. And I was talking to a guy called Chris, and it's a really funny story. I met him, he does tech stuff, he's based in Leeds now, and literally on the conversation I was saying to him, where are you from? Where did you grow up? And he said, Liverpool. I said, whereabouts? And he said, McGull. And he literally grew up on the street next to me. And he since went on to do good things. He's a bit older than me. But he actually made the point saying, well, actually, no, he's got a lot of what are classed as middle class friends who actually have the same work and drive, determination, ethic. And actually it made me make the point that it proved the point that I only know the world from my viewpoint, and it's not always right. But my point is, it's that encouragement, but it's also very easy when you're told you'll only ever be a hairdresser, you apply to 5 places and they all say no, to stay in your box, is where I think it often takes someone special to have such drive and determination to achieve something that you just keep trying regardless. Does that make sense? And I find that in itself quite inspirational, because a lot of people would give up, and actually it's very easy to get advice from people who tell you to give up just because they would, but it doesn't mean you should. Does that make sense? So I just wanted to kind of highlight that bit. And
so what I would say is, when I'm hiring, if I'm interviewing somebody, if I see that spark, that's what I hire for. I don't care about, their background or anything, but I do always look for that spark, that drive, that passion, that willingness to learn. And I agree with you that it can be in any sort of background. And I don't know what it is. I don't know what's in me that has made me do that. My parents still wish I would have just got a proper job and stayed in Newcastle. That's,
So what happened next?
So I got into Northumbria to do law. I had a grant to do it, which you wouldn't get today.
Yeah.
I was working, using the admin skills I got. Any chance I got, afternoons, Wednesday afternoons for sport, none of that. I was working, any chance I got. And so 4 years later, I left university with a law degree, a legal practice certificate, a load of debt from my student loans, which I couldn't have gone without them.
Same.
But I no longer had a husband. I no longer had a home. And I didn't have a training contract.
Okay.
And a training contract is what you need to be a solicitor. What nobody had ever explained, and I had nobody to tell me, nobody to share this with, that law is quite an excluding, not exclusive, but excluding profession. And it really heavily relies on, the family links, and you'll know somebody and you'll get a nudge, and that's largely, not exclusively, but largely how you get a training contract. And at that time, I didn't imagine I was ever going to leave the Northeast. So I was looking for training contracts in the Northeast, and I was just getting absolutely nowhere. And I've probably carried that failure with me. I failed to get a training contract. I carried that with me until very, very recently. And one of the things I realized recently is that at the time that I did law, women had only been allowed to do law, to be solicitors, for 70 years.
Yeah.
That's less than one average lifetime. And so for me to have got into do law, how many people from Benwell did law? Even at that time, it was so recently that women were allowed to be in, and I was a woman from Benwell. So no wonder I didn't get a training contract is partly what I think.
But I think it's I always try and be quite like philosophical about it, but it's almost how much the world has changed in that time, because actually it's only 100 and something years ago women couldn't vote either.
Exactly.
And it's just there's a lot of issues, some of which I purposely don't touch on, but different cultures around the world have different views on things. But actually I think overall we seem to be going in the right direction, because when we started the conversation, a lot of it was heavily to do with about how can you tap into the real talent around the world, because the truth is, we might touch on it later, more diverse thinking and organizations are generally more successful. You get different viewpoints and all that stuff. And it's now from a I think historically there was a lot of things where men always, rightly or wrongly, had the power, they had the jobs, they had the control. But actually now people realize that women are just as smart, if not smarter than men are. This is useful. We've got a better team. We've got half the world's workforce that can add value on stuff. And then likewise, part of me does love the ability when people only get judged on talent, which I kind of love. One of the big things which got me recently was that my cousin's son, so my second cousin Josh, went to uni to do engineering. From his A levels, aced it, got like 5 A stars, and I know that's numbers now, but I'm old. But the point is, he actually got the grades, did the interview, and got into Cambridge. But the issue was none of the colleges picked him, so therefore he didn't actually get to go because he wasn't selected. So we went to Sheffield, where I went to do to do engineering anyway. But it proved the point. But if he was Boris Johnson's nephew, he would have got picked.
Yeah, of course.
And I hate the fact that people get excluded for the old things. That I get that that's how it happened 400 years ago. But likewise, if he went to Eton instead of a college in Bentham or Liverpool or whatever, you get in, you get these opportunities. And the thing that really annoys me as well is that you then, when they used to call it the milk round. So as an engineer, what would happen is the big firms would go around the top universities and hire people. But the issue is, if you don't get into one of the top universities, you don't get the same potential to get the same job career. And it's almost, it's one of my things, but it's almost the system, it's getting better, but the system seemed to be set up to keep the rich people rich, get them the better jobs, which gets them the better opportunities, the better pats on the back, and almost keep the poor people poor. And anyone that can fight against that and send the ladder back down and really help, to me, that's really important.
Really, really important. But I think even if you do get in, what's life like when you're there and you don't have the money to join in the lifestyle? I actually Sopra Steria, which is an organisation I'll talk about later, what my former boss established a sponsorship for students.
Oh, just whilst Louise's connection seems to have frozen. Hi, Louise, your connection frozen. Don't worry. I hope it's going to come back. I'm just going to shout out James. The guy James commented how actually it's not always skills, it's your connections, it's your network, it's that kind of thing. It's the nepotism. I completely agree with what he said. Sorry, it was when I thought you'd frozen. I thought I'd just wing it and improvise until you came back. But James, thank you for the comment.
Again, I was just talking about the fact that my former boss wanted to ensure that people who got onto the university course then had money for a laptop, money to go to the pub on a Friday night, because that's makes you part of university. If you don't have that, you're more likely to drop out.
I was on a call with someone at, 11 o'clock today, and I was trying to make the point about why we're trying to do everything we're trying to do. And it was the point that when I was doing engineering, it was a full-time course. So you had lunch with people every day just because you were in lectures all day, every day. And, some of my course mates would say, oh, do you want to go to Witherspoon's and get a £3 burger, lunch, whatever? And I knew I couldn't afford it. And it's true that what I kind of not hated myself for, but when I went into a world of much better off people, I was ashamed. And there was that balance of where I didn't want to admit it, but I knew, it is what it is. But that can be a horrible feeling. Does that make sense? I know
yes,
it makes sense.
It excludes you. Yeah, my current husband is similar. Actually, he used to be unable to afford lunch at work, and he just used to say, "I'm going out for a walk. I just want to walk." Yeah. He didn't just want to walk. He wanted to have the burger and chips, but he couldn't afford it.
But I think what's interesting, and I'm going to riff off this a little bit. So we connected recently. It was to do that post, and it was to do with representation on panels. Does that make sense? And this, as I mentioned at the start, was to do with a particular panel that had 7 white guys on it, and that's how it always was. But the reason why I wanted to relate this to what you've just said is that for people that don't even think there's an issue, it's because they haven't experienced it, if that makes sense. For people that have lived experience of a topic, be it not being able to afford lunch or rejection from universities or whatever, it's a real thing. And my point is, just because someone else or I'm white, as you know, so I've never experienced racism. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist or I should dismiss it. It's that different viewpoint. And what was interesting was that ironically, that when I put that post up, my wife actually spotted it first. So she spotted it on Twitter, the photo, and she was like, "Oh, isn't this terrible?" And I was like, "I'm going to say something." But then part of me was like, "But I know it's going to cause rough, people aren't going to like it. Some people aren't going to like it." And then even yesterday, I spotted another one commented on it. And someone, again, it was another white male, but it was to do with, "Oh, this is boring. Stop talking about this." And what I find funny is how certain people intentionally try and shut you down to stop talking about it if it doesn't benefit them. And part of me's wondered, is it because they don't think there's an issue, or is it because they don't want it to change, or is it just something else I haven't even thought of? Do they think the irony is I'm definitely not a woke person. I'm just not. But I still believe in fairness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it completely makes sense. I think it's only very recently that I've started to think that it wasn't just the fact that people didn't appreciate it or didn't believe it, but now actually I do think that there is an element of society that doesn't want things to change. It's only very recently I've come to that conclusion.
I think one of the things that because I was trying to think, is that I've always wanted to be a fair person, and almost, I noticed we've got the same glasses. These are from Asda, I think, or IKEA. Anyway, but it's that balance of when I think now that I work for myself, now I control my own destiny, nobody can fire me. Does that make sense? So almost then, or not hire me. So actually, I'm more willing to speak out on certain issues, because actually I'm not worried about the repercussions. But the fact that I even think that way proves that something is still inherently wrong, because I know it is. Does that make sense? And it's just, but I hate it, but what I also want to do, it's the reason why 4 out of my last 5 guests have all been women. But it's that balance of where when you do actually have a platform that you can use, again, I can use it however I want. I could interview all middle-aged white business owner men, but that doesn't help the world in the way that I think we should be moving towards. But actually, ironically, I think part of it was because I was raised by my mum. I actually get on better with women anyway. Silly as it sounds, I just do. I think there's less. I know it's not none, but I think there's less like ego and almost clashing heads, as well. Sometimes with like alpha white males, they all hate each other, and I don't want to be part of that. I'm trying to do something else. Anyway, so
Love it.
as your
That you are.
but as your kind
So,
of career kind of progressed,
yeah.
you
So
start to do more kind of commercial type roles. But I'll let you kind of talk about it
yeah.
in your.
So just because I couldn't get a training contract, I fell back on my admin skills and joined a company called EDS that had just arrived in the Northeast. EDS being Electronic Data Systems, the American company owned by Ross Perot. So they were doing an outsourcing of IT. I had no clue what an outsourcing of IT was, but they were doing it for the Rolls-Royce organisation, two parts of that organisation, Ray Roll and Clark Chapman in the Northeast. So I joined the organisation to provide admin support as they were setting up in the Northeast to provide IT outsourcing. And from there, I worked my way into the procurement team, which was doing, contracting for buying components that we used in the solutions. And then from there into customer-facing negotiations. Before too long, I thought, actually, I'm earning more money and doing very similar things using my law degree skills. So I'm comfortable, I'm happy, bring it on. And from there, I went to BT as a commercial manager. BT is where I did my MSc, and we were doing things like convergence of communications, storage area networks. Now it's all cloud. Then if you had a great big storage solution in your basement, you were doing really, really well. So how things have changed. And then later digital transformation were the sorts of technologies that I was working on. SAP was Enterprise Resource Management Solutions. And at the time I was there, they had pretty much saturated the enterprise market. So they developed SAP in a box for SMEs. And I negotiated one of the very first SME contract for SAP because they hadn't expected to need to change their market. Did a few firsts, went to Airwave Solutions. Airwave provides secure communications for police, fire and ambulance. And we also did the Olympics in London, 2012, providing secure communications there. It was one of the few things that the Olympics couldn't go ahead if the comms weren't right. And that was where I was actually put onto some leadership programs, applied, assessment centres. So I was kind of going for these things, any opportunity I could see. The MSc in BT, in Accenture, having this opportunity for an emerging leaders program, apply for it, get on it, do it. So going for it. So in Airwave, I got on this program, and it was another life-changing, probably series of events. The Emerging Leaders program, it sent me to Windsor Leadership. Don't know if you know Windsor Leadership Trust. You're not.
It's active listening, so I'm just listening to you talk. I don't know what it is the answer.
Okay, so Windsor Leadership Trust, it's basically a retreat at Windsor Castle. You go for a week, and there are people there from the military, from the clergy, from business, from third sector, and you talk about your leadership challenges. So for me to be there as part of Airwave's leadership program, I remember standing on the threshold, the doorway into the room where everybody was gathering for drinks. And I so badly wanted to run away because I did not belong in that room, is how I was really feeling at the time. There was people like a wing commander in there who will probably laugh if he listens to this, as he probably will. I was so intimidated. Religious people, I don't follow a religion. I respect anyone who does. But for me, just looking at a clergyman was like, how could I possibly have a conversation with them? We've got nothing in common. But actually, the retreat showed me different ways to lead. It showed me that you can lead for good. and that you can be your own person, and that it's much, much more important to take care of the people in your charge. And that was where I thought, okay, I can be a leader in the way that I want to be a leader. I touched on servant leadership in my master's, but I didn't think I'd ever use it. But then understanding that by developing my team, by giving the team the things that they need to excel and to get obstacles out of their way, that is the kind of leader that I could be, and I became. So Windsor Leadership was awesome for that, and I've been forever grateful.
No, cool. Because I think that's one of the really interesting things that gets me, that when there's a huge difference between the academic theory on a topic, leadership, servant leadership, and actually doing it. And it's when I have massive respect for the military, less so for religion, for various different reasons. But it's that, you know, I love people that have lived experience of stuff as well. I also have a pet peeve of people that teach, but they don't do. Does that make sense? So they'll talk about how you should do this, you do that, but then you actually say to them, well, do you do it? And it's like, no. But I have massive respect for that kind of thing. And then you moved on, and then you've since launched, well, actually 2 businesses in your time.
Yeah.
Would you happy to talk us about what you do with those?
Yeah, so the first one is My Folks, and that is an elder care service that is digitally connecting people who need support with people who can provide that support. It's early stages. I was on an accelerator in 2019 in Newcastle, an aging accelerator. So it was born a long time ago, born out of the fact that I was living in the south with parents who were starting to struggle in the north, and I was up and down the motorway and trying to be in several places at once. So that's where the idea for My Folks came.
What was it that made you want to start it? So not about the idea, but actually, did you have an itch inside you that you thought, you know what, I fancy doing my own thing for change? Or what was that kind of, you know, burned up inside you?
So I think I've always had that. I've always, some of that independence that you talked about. I had my dad and my brother set up Apex Driveways when I was doing my law degree, because they had those skills, and I thought, okay, we can do driveways. And we can have that business. So it's always been there that I would quite like to do it on my own, even though I couldn't risk it. For all of these years, I couldn't risk it. I've had to earn money.
But again, so just on that one, before we kind of keep going, it's that is an issue which affects what I class as real people, that actually you can't just give up work and spend some savings to run a company. Because actually I recently applied to something called Y Combinator, which is the world's biggest startup accelerator. If you want to build $1 billion startup, that's where you go to. And the advice that they give everyone is, oh yeah, you know, after college, university, whatever, just set up your startup and work on that for a few years, and if it doesn't work out, get a job. And it's one of my pet peeves, and I've seen it in the YouTube comments. It's people saying, look, regular people can't do that. You need to earn money to pay your rent, feed your kids, pay your mortgage, pay off your debts, your student loans. You can't just not earn money. And again, it's a privileged thing that not everyone sees. And actually, I remember watching the Stephen Bartlett, he does podcasts and interviews and stuff as well. And he was interviewing a guy that, and bear in mind, I saw Stephen Bartlett talk at a thing in London a few weeks ago, but his whole thing is poor background, worked his way up, launched the thing, did well. But he was talking to a guy who was American who launched something, and basically it went quite well. But when he was interviewing the guy, same as we're talking now, this guy who was white, middle-class American goes on to talk about how growing up his life was so difficult. His dad, who was mega rich, had a Ferrari, had all this stuff, but he didn't see him that much, so he was really unhappy. And then he went to college and, you know, didn't enjoy it, so he dropped out of university and then started a startup, and he used the savings. And it was screaming to me, it was like, yeah, but the reason you were comfortable to both mess about in university and not work hard is because you knew you had a safety net that if it didn't work out, daddy could get you a job. You then go into work for a law firm or wherever it was. After like a few months, you decided, you know what, I'm not really feeling this, I'm going to quit. Again, you can only do that because you're rich. And it was that balance of where it's not a level playing field, but I kind of wanted Stephen Bartlett to call him out on it. And most people don't. But it's the real world angle of, if you come from your background or mine or lots of other people, you can't just quit and do stuff because you need to earn money, and it's that real world that actually, unfortunately, a lot of the people that talk on the topic in the space, either on Instagram especially, pretend that they all drive Lamborghinis and they're minted and they got rich quick, or they never declare that actually you had rich parents. And it kind of, even Donald Trump, his dad was a multimillionaire before he even got started, and it's not a fair system. But my point is it's that balance of what. It's why I really respect anyone that's done it and launched their own thing, because often a lot of people do have the burning desire to do something, but actually it is harder than people think, if that makes sense. Sorry, Karen.
No, much harder. I met Stephen at Newcastle Startup Week a few years ago. He spoke, and I did have the chance to have a private conversation with him. So he is definitely inspiring. But also at that time, I was offered investment in my folks. But one of the terms and conditions, and obviously I read terms and conditions, I looked at it, I wasn't allowed to continue any other work. They wanted me to solely focus on this. But I wanted to solely focus on it, but I needed the freedom to earn money, and that was a constraint that I just couldn't accept. So I didn't get the funding because I couldn't agree to those terms and conditions.
Were you a solo female founder at that time? Because I know other friends that, again, similar position, solo female founder wanted to do it, and people wouldn't back them because they're a woman and they're on their own. I was just interested to...
No, I was also selected for Pitch at the Palace, the regional heats of Pitch at the Palace. And I pitched in the Northeast, and I didn't get through. And everybody who did, my take on it was wearing chinos and a white shirt and doing fintech. And I really felt, on my LinkedIn profile now, I say I'm a female founder at 54.
Yeah.
I'm proud of it. But it doesn't necessarily mean I'll get investment from all quarters.
Okay. So I am conscious of time. It's that balance. I always respect people's time, and I think the record for an interview, it went on for 1 hour and 37 minutes, which was a lady called Victoria, and we just had a really good chat, and I forgot what time it was, and that's part of the reason why I have a clock now, just because I've also had guests where I can talk a lot, and I could tell that they needed to leave, and I felt bad. Long story short, so it's just to kind of move forward. Can we talk about TEDx? Can we talk about TEDx a little bit? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
So for one, what was it about doing a TED Talk, TEDx talk that made you want to do it? And then also, how did you find the process? I know we spoke about some of our mutual friends. You got Duncan and Ashley and a few of those guys, but just it's a topic that I've been applying to different. I would love to do one as well. But why did you want to do it? How did you find the process? How did you prefer? And then actually, how did you find actually doing it as well?
Okay, it's quite a lot there. So one of the things that I've learned is that you can't just expect to progress by doing a good job. You've got to be seen to be doing a good job. Ideally, you should be sponsored, but you've got to be seen. So you've got to put yourself out there. And for me, it can be excruciating. I'm not going to lie. You called me out right in the beginning, because I do find this stuff difficult.
But the interview's gone up 100 times since. But it's sometimes you need the encouraging nudge to take away the safety net and let someone flourish. I wasn't being mean, I promise.
No, and I didn't take it as such, but I would be apprehensive. So one of the reasons is you need to be seen to be doing it. One of the reasons was it was a challenge for me to do that. I look at it now and I think, I was so stiff and formal, and I wish I'd done it differently, and I wish I could do it differently. And one of the other reasons is I'm interested in the topic. And the overall subject for the TEDx at the time was build a better future. I had the year before been invited by World I can't remember it now, World Commerce and Contracting. But it was at the time that I was working with them, it was IACCM, the International Association of Commercial Contract Managers. You can see why they changed it. So they had invited me to speak at their European conference in Krakow, and they asked me to argue for AI and automation. And they had somebody else who was arguing against, it's going to destroy the world. So I had developed I've always been interested in technology. Then I had to sort of understand that and get get behind that. And then I had the opportunity to do a TEDx, and this seemed like a really good subject to talk about. So my TEDx was about the ethics of automation. And I kind of talked about bias. I talked about, the chance of us losing jobs. And the angle that I took was that it shouldn't be scary. It gives us new opportunities. It gives us the opportunities to do things that are more empathetic, to do things that only humans can do. So I did really want to get that message out there.
So was this in 2019? No, what year was this?
This is 2019.
2019. So and it was one of the topics I wanted to cover. So in 2023, where we are now, the reason I say that is that this gets pre-recorded and it'll live on the internet forever. Anyway, so this year we've had ChatGPT launch. There's a whole range of large language models out now. We've got a lot of the creative AI tools where there's loads of ethics around that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, one of the things that I've genuinely looked at is that, it's some of the video stuff where you can speak different languages. You have synthesized people, like a deep fake, that now I could, if I wanted to, get a digital me that can replicate me and do all kinds. But the point is, it's exploded. And if anything, it's only going to exponentially increase. Mm-hmm. One of the big things that I know I've been really and this is just this week, trying to really figure out is that how there was an article, there was a post about Levi's. So Levi's have said that they're going to embrace diversity and using 100% AI automated models, have different women and people with different backgrounds model their clothes. But the whole point was they're not paying any humans to any black models. They're not real people, but what that's going to do is actually impact. My first business was photography, so I know a lot about photography, but it's going to impact photography, people that do lighting, people that have venues, people that do catering for venues, models themselves. And what I'm really worried about is even down to copywriters, graphic designers, whichever. Now, I'm worried that almost every job in the world is going to be at risk, because actually, rather than me pay £2,000 to hire some creatives, come up with an event and go and do it, I could actually just go to my AI tool, make me an image that looks like this. And if I'm not happy, I can tweak it, change the description. But it's like, that's real. Because in theory, I spend a lot of money for my startup and business hiring people to do stuff. If I chose a different path, I could just save all that money, invest in the tool, and they're out of a job. And I just, from an ethics point of view on AI, that kind of stuff, what's your take on it? Am I worrying too much or?
Maybe a little bit too much, but it's genuine. And I think things will happen that makes it, there are jobs that weren't previously thought of. So when we talk about how do we educate kids as to what they can be, there are some jobs that we don't even know they can be yet. Who is going to be the interface between the AI and the humans? Chief interface officer and things like that we don't know yet. So I think there will be new jobs. That's one thing. I think some people who are in the field where jobs will be eroded are looking at how they can take some of their profits and retrain people in other ways to do other things. And I think so that's important. If you are going to save money by avoiding using people, how do you create education programs so that people can do the new jobs? And those jobs are more of the emotional jobs.
But so I can see why a government who have to look after the overall population might look at that retraining. But it's that we're both commercial backgrounds. We both know organizations that if they currently have an overhead of £1 million a year, but actually through efficiencies and new tools, they can halve that and massively increase their net profit, they're probably going to do it, especially if it's outsourced stuff.
Yeah.
And it's a genuine worry that the irony is that I love creative stuff. I love working with creative people, and especially on LinkedIn at the moment, you get photographers and people saying, look what I've created with this AI tool. But the irony is that then it's like, well, I don't need to pay you £800 for a photo shoot. I could pay the £6 and do it myself.
Yeah.
And it's a genuine thing. I think a lot of people will debate.
And I think we need as a society to start to reset the expectations. Maybe we could instead of people having jobs and careers, maybe we can, those people who are making the money can support those who aren't to do things like be companions for the elderly and do other things. We don't necessarily need to be making money for ourselves.
Think, being honest, that will happen?
Yes, I do. You there are people like you who's doing this podcast, and me who's taken the time to join it, because I do really believe in that. And I think probably, I'm hoping that the younger generation seems to care much more about community and things like that than you know, in the 80s where it was all about money. So I'm hoping that society can evolve in ways that will accommodate AI. I do think regulation for it is really, really important. And I do think we need to think about these things, and we're not thinking about them. I think when I gave my talk just 4 years ago, it didn't seem very real to the people of Newcastle who were in the
6 months ago. It was that balance of where I'm quite up on like tech stuff, but this is the first time it really hit home, and it was like, wow. And it's just, it's the way it's because I watched, there's a guy who runs one of the major companies giving interviews on like Forbes, and basically they're also purposely throttling back their deployment because they know people will get scared, and if they don't tease it out slowly, regulation and governments will just shut it down altogether. And I think ChatGPT is already banned in Italy. I think it was Italy. But it was almost, because the other thing that got me is that with the worry is, and it was the classic science fiction thing from 70s and 80s, where I worry that the world will tend more into the haves and have-nots. So you're going to have more developed nations embrace these technologies quicker than developing nations. But then it's that ability that you'll have people in developing nations that are graphic designers and built their life on it, and then someone from Newcastle or Silicon Valley sells into Africa, and just I worry that we're going to actually have more wage inequality because of things like AI. Because the prime example was that with Neuralink, which is Elon Musk's one of his many startups. So for anyone that doesn't know, it's an implant, a chip on the brain that can both help you process stuff. It's also designed to help with motor neuron diseases and lots of positive things. But the idea is that people who can afford it can actually, in theory, connect their mind to the internet. This is like in the future. But again, it gives you an advantage based on money and different things against everyone else. And I worry in a way that we're going to have more disparity between rich and poor.
So that I can't see into the future, so I don't know how it'll turn out, but I hope it'll be different. But one of the things that I might challenge from what you've just said is that some of the developing nations can actually leapfrog the current developed nations. They're working on it. I was lucky enough to spend some time in Rwanda, working in Rwanda, and Cameroon and a few other places. You can see that they can actually accelerate and do better than we are the place they're at now. So I don't necessarily think it'll increase the divide that we have now, but there could be different divides.
I absolutely 100% want just a level playing field for everyone. Because the irony is, from a business strategy point of view, that say if we take universities, one of the disadvantages that universities have in 2023 is that they have £300 million worth of assets, overheads, buildings that a lean startup doesn't necessarily have, but you can actually target the same market. The point being that if you're in Cameroon, Rwanda, you might not necessarily be tied to legacy systems that people don't want to give up on, which then in itself, if you're innovative, can give you the advantage, because it's the whole sunken cost fallacy thing of where when people are trying to embrace new things. And the prime example, obviously Meta / Facebook have been trying to launch the metaverse. In theory, you could create the world's best metaverse hospital, school, entertainment thing from Rwanda, because it's not real. So I'm with you. Part of the reason why I love to do this is to speak to smart people and almost debate different issues, because I think it's because it's topical and it's happening right now. It's a really interesting thing.
It's almost overly discussed at the moment, and there is some scaremongering, and actually people are turning off from it because it's becoming boring. But we need to get the balance back. These things absolutely need to be top of mind and being discussed and regulated and managed. How will it turn out? I don't know. I'd like to come back in 100 years and see what's happened.
Oh, cool. Just as we kind of start to wrap up, there are various different questions that I always like to ask. Basically, this is actually my favorite kind of part of the interview because it's the value for me. Would you be happy to share what's the best piece of advice you've ever had?
Yeah, sure. So knowing your values, and that came out of Windsor. So understanding what your values are, and ways to establish what your values are, if you don't mind me explaining it, is what would you want somebody to write in your obituary? Would you want them to write, he was kind, she was really ambitious, they were rich? What is it that you would want people to say about you if you were no longer there? Or the other thing is, if your value, whether you know it's your value or not, is impinged, you will see red, you will feel furious about that. So if you have that fury, you think, okay, I feel furious, I must have a value that's being impinged here. That's how you can identify them. And so I can share mine. It was quite interesting, you talked about resilience. So resilience is one of mine. Graft is another. I don't respect anybody who doesn't do the work. I'm not saying that you should work all of the time, but when you're working, work and do good with it. So I think graft is important to me. And my dad used to call it graft, he's a builder. So graft is one. Equality of opportunity for very obvious reasons, and resilience. So knowing your values. And then if you have any difficult decisions, you look to your values to decide what you should do.
Okay.
Like if you're having to make people redundant, if you're choosing between using an AI solution and employing people, what do your values require you to do here? Because that's the only guide you've got. So that for me is really important.
Honestly, I think it's really good, and I think more important now than ever. Honestly, I kind of love that. The other question is that if you were to give advice to your younger self, so you could pick you that didn't know what O levels were, you could have you when you're applying for jobs or whichever. If you were to give advice to your younger self, what would it be?
The first, so there's probably several bits and loads of lessons that I've learned, but the first bit is don't limit yourself. I decided that I couldn't do science. I decided I couldn't be a journalist before I even really tried. So the first bit, don't limit yourself, and try not to let anybody else limit you either.
Any others? It's just when you said there were 7 minutes. But no, I think it's awesome. And I think that's one of the biggest things. It's limiting beliefs that people self-impose or are imposed on by others that actually, what's quite funny, the amount of times I've in some ways been like the rebel, and my family's always been stuff that I've wanted to do. Prime example, I graduated, used to work in Jamaica. It was a very big construction international project, and to everyone at home, they felt like I'd done this great career and started this great stuff, but I hated it. It wasn't for me. I didn't like the culture, the values, the people. I didn't like what we were doing, and I wanted to basically leave. And I had so many people tell me, "Oh, it's such a huge mistake. You don't know what you're doing." And I had to go with my heart, and I'm 100% glad I did. But the point is, it's that conviction, because you will have people that you know and love try and stop you from doing something, and it's got nothing to do with you. It's got everything to do with them. Does that make sense? So
it does. So some women are told not to do maths because it'd be too difficult. Don't go into a science because it'd be really hard. And that's because they care about their child, and so they don't want them to suffer in that way. But they apply their concern to the child in that way, and so that can be quite limiting.
But what's ironic about that is that if you watch, there's so many films that are out there about female mathematicians in history that have tackled problems, including getting men on the moon, and then you've got the Enigma Code and lots of other stuff that play and have played a massively important role in society. But yeah, I'm with you that I know some people might have discouraged other people from taking certain subjects, but it's not based in any form of truth. It was just expectation that I'm going to be a hairdresser. That's a good thing for you.
Absolutely. So in terms of other things that I would offer, take every opportunity for free education that you can get. Those courses that I got on that were paid for by BT or by Airwave. And there are loads online now. You can do Harvard courses, short ones that are free and things like that. So look for any opportunity to get free education and grasp it with both hands is one that I would say. In meetings, so moving on from my younger self to now, you need to be visible. So you need to do the extra stuff. You need to try and get sponsorship. And in terms of being visible as well, it's quite useful if you're in a meeting, sit either opposite the chairperson or next to them, because everybody else in the room looks at the chair. And then you're seen. If you want to make a point, you're seen.
That's actually quite a good tip. I've done hundreds of these and nobody's ever said that before. Just as we kind of wrap up, because unfortunately I do have to shoot off as well, is there anything you want to talk about and plug before we go?
No, I'm only 54, so there's lots still to come. So nothing more than that, other than, and you said it as well, if you are successful, you absolutely have a duty to pay it forward.
Yeah, cool. I love it. Well, thank you. Honestly, thank you for your time. So I've really enjoyed this. And I think what's been really interesting is just to cover a lot of different topics and just generally just talk out loud about stuff, because I have been a little bit, I say, worried about AI, and it's almost when I can see how it could go, because I know I've seen the best and the worst in people. And it's a really interesting time because, again, I'll be able to look back when I am 17 and say, well, actually, look, see what happened. Because what was interesting was that I watched the film Enemy of the State with Will Smith. And at the time, that was 1998 because I Googled it. So this was kind of before the internet properly took off, and certainly before the iPhone wasn't launched till 2007. And the whole premise of the film was people worrying about infringement of rights and tracking where you are and what you talk about, and how it was going to be this disastrous thing. But it was based on a world that they knew in 1998. You fast forward to 2023, or even like the 2015's Edward Snowden stuff, and it's almost, we have no idea where things are going to go. But actually, you just hope that good, honest people make good, honest decisions at some point, and that hopefully all kind of works out. But no, thank you for your time. So I've really enjoyed it. Please kind of keep in touch. And yeah, we'll speak soon.
Thanks a lot. Cheers. Bye.